Her true story from Kentucky. "Go die somewhere else," he screamed, throwing boiling water at me so I took back everything I ever gave him. The water wasn't meant to scald, only to humiliate. It was hot enough to sting, to make me gasp and stumble back, but not hot enough to leave a permanent burn on my skin. The burn it left was somewhere deeper, a place bandages couldn't reach. It had been a Thursday morning, the air thick with the damp, sweet smell of Kentucky bluegrass after a night of rain. The droplets still clung to my kitchen window, creating tiny rivers that caught the weak morning light. My son, David, was late for his job managing the local auto parts store, a job I had helped him get by co-signing the loan for his first reliable car 10 years ago. The memory of that day still stung, how grateful he'd seemed then, how he'd promised to pay me back as soon as things picked up. He was clattering around the kitchen now, his temper as thin as the cheap linoleum on the floor that Crystal had insisted on installing over my original hardwood. "It's more practical, Mom," she'd said, not asking, just telling, just like everything else in what used to be my home. I was at the sink, my hands slow from the morning stiffness that arthritis brought, washing the breakfast dishes he and his wife, Crystal, had left behind. The same blue ceramic plates my mother had given me as a wedding gift 43 years ago. Crystal had complained about them too. "So old-fashioned, Martha. Don't you want something more modern?" But I'd held firm on this one small thing. Some battles you have to pick. The kitchen smelled of bacon grease and bitter coffee, the kind of morning smell that should have been comforting, but somehow felt heavy instead. David's work shirt hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight since the stress of the promotion, the same promotion I'd encouraged him to apply for, the same promotion that had made him even more short-tempered and demanding. "Can you move?" he barked, shoving past me to get to the electric kettle on the counter. The kettle I'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago, back when I still believed small gestures of love might soften the growing hardness in his voice. I sidestepped, my hip protesting with a sharp twinge. The same hip that had ached for months, but which I'd never mentioned because complaining about my health was apparently another burden I wasn't allowed to place on them. I was in his way. I was always in his way, it seemed, in the house I'd lived in for 35 years, the house where I'd raised him, where I'd nursed him through childhood fevers and teenage heartbreaks. I heard the click of the kettle boiling, that familiar sound that had marked thousands of morning routines. I heard him pour the water into his favorite mug, the one with the faded "World's Best Son" text that I'd given him on his 16th birthday. The irony wasn't lost on me. And then I heard his heavy footsteps behind me again, the same footsteps that had run through these halls as a boy, chasing his father through the house in games of tag that seemed like a lifetime ago. He wanted the sugar bowl on the shelf just above my head, the crystal bowl that had been Earl's grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations. Instead of asking me to pass it, instead of saying, "Excuse me," the way I'd taught him when he was small, he growled, a low, frustrated sound in the back of his throat like an animal cornered. "For God's sake, Mom, can you just not be there for 1 minute?" The words hit me like cold water. Not be there, in my own kitchen, in my own house. The house where I'd made him countless breakfasts, packed countless lunches, where I'd waited up countless nights when he was a teenager, worried sick, until I heard his key in the lock. And then it happened. He didn't just shove past. He swung the still-steaming kettle in a wide, careless arc, his frustration boiling over just like the water inside it. A wave of hot water sloshed over the side, splashing onto my arm and the front of my worn cotton house dress, the dress I'd sewn myself from fabric I'd bought on sale at Henderson's 5 years ago. I cried out, a small, sharp sound of shock and pain. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, and for a moment, I thought, hoped, he might show some concern, some remorse. But David's face twisted with something worse than indifference. Crystal, who had been watching from the doorway with her arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips like she was enjoying some private entertainment, didn't move to help. She just sighed, long and dramatic, as if my very existence was the greatest inconvenience of her life. Her perfectly manicured nails, nails I'd paid for during one of her emergencies, drummed against her silk robe. The robe I'd given her last Christmas, hoping it might earn me some small measure of kindness. David turned, his face a mask of contorted rage, not at what he'd done, but at the fact that I had reacted at all. The kettle was still in his hand, steam rising from its spout like some twisted offering. His eyes that had once looked at me with love, with trust, with the simple need of a child for his mother, were cold and calculating. "What is your problem?" he screamed, his voice echoing in the small kitchen, bouncing off the walls I'd painted by hand, the windows I'd hung curtains in, the countertops I'd scrubbed clean every night for decades. "All you do is get in the way, eat our food, and complain. I am sick of it, sick of you. If you're so miserable, why don't you just go die somewhere else? Go die somewhere else." The words hung in the air, more scalding than the water, more permanent than any physical burn. They seemed to echo off every surface, every memory, every moment of love and sacrifice that had built this house, this life, this relationship that was now crumbling before my eyes. He didn't apologize. He didn't check to see if I was hurt. He didn't even seem to register that he'd just told his mother, the woman who had given him life, who had sacrificed her own dreams to build his, to go die. He just slammed the kettle down on the counter with such force that the sugar bowl rattled, grabbed his keys from the hook by the door, and stormed out of the house, leaving me standing there, dripping and trembling, in the center of the kitchen my husband and I had built with our own 2 hands. The back door slammed with such violence that the small window in it cracked, a spider web of damage that seemed to mirror the fractures in my heart. Crystal watched me for a long moment, her eyes cold and triumphant, like she'd won some contest I didn't even know we were playing. Then she turned and walked away, her silk robe swishing behind her, leaving me alone with the echo of his words and the dull, throbbing sting on my arm. I didn't cry. The time for tears had passed years ago, worn away by countless small cruelties, countless moments of being treated like a stranger in my own home. Instead, a silence fell over me, a cold, clear silence that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. In that silence, I made a decision that would change everything. He wanted me to go die somewhere else. Fine, but first I was going to remind him who had given him the life he was so eager to have me leave. The house felt different after he left. Not quieter. It had been quiet for years, the kind of strained quiet that comes from walking on eggshells, from measuring every word, every movement, every breath. But now it felt expectant, like it was waiting for something to happen. I walked through the room slowly, my wet dress clinging uncomfortably to my skin, but I ignored the discomfort. I had bigger things to think about. In the living room, I stopped in front of the mantelpiece where our family photos used to sit. Crystal had replaced them with what she called modern art, abstract pieces that looked like accidents to me, but what did I know? I was just the old woman who got in the way. The hardwood floors creaked under my feet, floors that Earl and I had installed ourselves during our 2nd year of marriage, working weekends and evenings. Learning as we went from a book Earl had checked out from the library, David had taken his first steps on these floors. He'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway just outside. He'd brought his first girlfriend home to meet us in the front parlor, nervous and proud and young. When had it all gone so wrong? I remembered the day he'd announced he was moving back home. He'd been 32, recently divorced, and I'd been so happy to have him back. "Just until I get back on my feet, Mom," he'd said, and I'd believed him. I'd wanted to believe him, but temporary had become permanent, and permanent had become entitled, and entitled had become cruel. Crystal had arrived 2 years later with her expensive tastes and her subtle ways of rearranging my life. She never said outright that she wanted me gone. She was too clever for that. Instead, it was suggestions. Wouldn't I be more comfortable in the basement bedroom? Wouldn't it be better if they handled the household finances? Wouldn't it be easier if I just stayed out of the way when they had company? And I'd agreed, step by step, compromise by compromise, until I'd compromised myself right out of my own life. That night, sleep was a stranger. I lay in the small, damp room in the basement they had designated as mine after they'd taken over my master bedroom 2 years ago. The room smelled of mildew and regret, a far cry from the bright, airy bedroom where Earl and I had spent our marriage, where we'd planned our dreams and shared our hopes. The ceiling was low, the single window small and high up on the wall. Sometimes, lying here in the dark, I felt like I was already in a grave, just waiting for someone to shovel the dirt on top. But not tonight. Tonight, I had work to do. From upstairs, I could hear the muffled sound of their television, the occasional burst of Crystal's high-pitched laughter. They were watching some comedy show, probably ordering takeout Chinese food and charging it to the credit card I'd co-signed for them. They had already forgotten the morning. For them, it was just another Thursday. For me, it was the end of a lifetime. I switched on the small bedside lamp, its light weak and yellow, casting long shadows across the cramped space. From under the loose floorboard beneath my bed, a hiding place I'd discovered by accident when I'd dropped an earring, I pulled out a small, locked metal box. Inside, wrapped in an old, soft flannel cloth that had once been one of Earl's shirts, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. It had been my husband Earl's originally. He'd used it to track crop yields and expenses for our small tobacco farm back in the 70s and 80s before the market crashed and we'd had to sell the land to pay off debts. After he passed, I'd started using it for something else entirely, something I'd never thought I'd need, but which had become my lifeline to sanity. I opened it, the leather creaking with age. The pages smelled of old paper and quiet grief, of memories both bitter and sweet. On the first page, in my neat bookkeeper's script, the same script I'd learned in high school, the same script I'd used to balance our family budget for 40 years, it read, "An accounting for David." I had never meant for it to be a list of debts. I had meant for it to be a record of love, a testament to all the ways I'd tried to help my son build his life. But seeing the entries now, in the dim light of my basement prison, they looked like charges on an indictment. I turned the pages slowly, each one a chapter in a story of endless giving and endless taking. My own history stared back at me, written in black ink that had faded to brown over the years. 1998, bail money after the DUI, $2,500. I remembered that night like it was yesterday. The phone call at 2 in the morning, David's voice slurred and frightened. "Mom, I need help." I made a mistake. I'd thrown on my robe and driven to the police station, my hands shaking as I wrote the check. "It'll never happen again." He'd promised. I learned my lesson. 2002, down payment on his first house, the one he'd shared with his first wife, $10,000. Sarah had been a sweet girl, and I'd had such hopes for them. David had been so proud of that little house, so excited to show me the nursery they'd painted yellow because they wanted to be surprised. The marriage had lasted 3 years. The house had been sold in the divorce. I'd never seen a penny of that money returned. 2005, covered his rent for 6 months after he lost the construction job, $4,800. He'd been so angry then, so bitter about the boss who'd fired him for showing up late. "It's not fair, Mom," he'd said. "I worked hard for that company. I'd believed him. I'd wanted to believe him. I'd paid his rent and told him to take his time finding something better." 2009, paid off his credit card debt so he could marry Crystal without a cloud over his head, $7,240. Crystal had been so grateful then, so sweet. She'd hugged me and called me the best mother-in-law in the world. She'd promised they'd pay me back as soon as they got settled. That had been 16 years ago. 2012, co-signed for and made the first 3 payments on the Ford F-150, $1,500. "I need reliable transportation for work, Mom," he'd explained. "This job could be the one that changes everything." I'd co-signed the loan and made the first payments when he'd been a little short. The truck was still in the driveway. The loan was still in my name. 2016, emergency dental surgery for Crystal when she'd cracked a tooth and had no insurance, $3,100. She'd been in real pain, I remembered. Her face had been swollen and she'd been crying. "I don't know what we're going to do," David had said. "The dentist wants the money up front." I'd emptied my savings account that day, but seeing Crystal's relief had made it worth it, or so I'd thought. On and on it went, page after page. Small loans that were never repaid, bills I'd covered, emergencies I'd smoothed over with my dwindling savings. Car repairs, medical bills, Christmas presents for grandchildren I rarely saw, insurance premiums, utility bills, grocery money, rent money, more car repairs, more medical bills, more emergencies. The total was a number I had never dared to add up before, but now, in the dim light of my basement room, I did the math. $87,450. Nearly $90,000 of my life savings, my security, my future, given freely to a son who had just told me to go die somewhere else. They had not just taken my home, they had drained my life savings, my security, my past, and my future, all while convincing themselves that I was the one who was the burden. They had taken my generosity and turned it into an expectation, my love and turned it into a weapon against me. I closed the book, the leather binding warm under my hands. The sting on my arm had faded to a dull ache, but the fire in my chest was burning bright and clean. For the first time in years, I felt completely awake, completely clear about what I needed to do. I had been their safety net for 35 years. Now, I was going to cut the rope. The next morning, while they were both at work, I moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I packed a single, small suitcase, the blue one Earl and I had bought for our honeymoon to Gatlinburg, back when we were young and broke and thought a weekend in the mountains was the height of luxury. I took only what mattered, the ledger, my wedding ring, a few photographs, and the few pieces of jewelry my mother had left me. Everything else, the furniture they'd pushed into corners, the dishes they'd replaced, the clothes they'd mocked, could stay. I was done carrying the weight of their contempt. Before I left, I walked through the house one last time. In the living room, I stopped at the built-in bookshelf Earl, and I had installed to hold our collection of books. Crystal had emptied most of the shelves, replacing our books with what she called decorative objects, meaningless knickknacks that she thought looked more sophisticated than the novels and biographies we'd loved. In the kitchen, I ran my hand along the counter where I'd prepared thousands of meals, where I'd packed countless lunches, where I'd stood just yesterday morning and been told to go die somewhere else. The counter was spotless. I'd cleaned it after the morning's drama, a lifetime of habit too strong to break even in my moment of crisis. I took the framed photo of Earl and me from the bedroom dresser, the one photo Crystal had allowed me to keep visible. We were standing proudly in front of this very house on the day we'd paid off the mortgage in 1991. Earl was wearing his best suit, the navy one he'd worn to church every Sunday. I was wearing the blue dress I'd sewn myself, the one that had made me feel beautiful despite our modest means. We looked so young in the photo, so hopeful. We'd worked 2 jobs each to pay off that house early, scrimping and saving, dreaming of the day when we'd own it free and clear. This is our legacy. Earl had said that day, his arm around my waist. This is what we're leaving to David. I slipped the photo into my purse and walked out the front door, not looking back. The morning air was crisp and clean, free of the stale atmosphere of resentment and entitlement that had filled the house for too long. I took a deep breath and felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. I walked to the corner and caught the city bus into town, the same bus route I'd taken to work for 20 years before I'd retired. The driver, a young man named Marcus who'd been driving this route for 3 years, smiled at me in recognition. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," he said cheerfully. "Heading downtown today?" "Yes," I said, dropping my fare into the box. "I have some business to attend to." Business. The word felt good in my mouth, solid and purposeful. I had business to attend to, and for the first time in years, it was my own business, my own choice, my own decision. The bus wound through the familiar streets of the town where I'd lived my entire life. Past the grocery store where I'd shopped for my family for decades, past the church where Earl and I had been married, past the school where I'd volunteered in David's classroom when he was small. All of it looked the same, but I felt different. I felt like I was seeing it all for the first time. I went straight to the law office of Miller, Abernathy, and Sons on Main Street. The building was old but well-maintained, with a brass plaque by the door that had been polished to a mirror shine. I'd been here before, of course. John Abernathy had handled Earl's will, had helped us with the house purchase, had been our family lawyer for 30 years. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle smile, looked up as I entered. "Mrs. Collins, how lovely to see you. Mr. Abernathy is in his office." "Shall I let him know you're here?" "Please," I said. "Tell him I need to see him about my property." John Abernathy was now a stooped, white-haired man in his late 70s, but his eyes were as sharp as they'd been when he was Earl's best friend and our family lawyer. He'd handled Earl's will, a simple document that left everything to me, his wife of 40 years. He'd also handled the paperwork when we'd paid off the house, when we'd updated our insurance, when we'd made our simple wills. "Martha," he said, rising from behind his massive mahogany desk to embrace me. His voice was a low, comforting rumble, the same voice that had guided us through legal documents and life decisions for decades. "I was wondering when you might finally come to see me." He knew. Of course he knew. The whole town probably knew, in the way small towns always do. They'd seen the new truck in my driveway, the way Crystal carried herself like she owned the place, the way I'd seemed to shrink a little more each year. They'd seen me at the grocery store, carefully counting coupons, while Crystal spent freely on organic food and expensive wine. They'd noticed that I'd stopped hosting the church ladies' tea, stopped volunteering at the library, stopped being Martha Collins, and started being David's mother who lives in the basement. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I placed the ledger on his wide mahogany desk, its leather cover dark against the polished wood. "John," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I need you to look at the deed for my property." He nodded, already pulling a thick, dusty file from the cabinet behind him. His movements were deliberate, practiced. He'd been doing this for 50 years, had seen every kind of family drama, every kind of betrayal. He opened the file and laid the original document on the desk between us. There it was, in black and white, Martha Annabelle Collins, sole owner, the house, the land, everything, all in my name. David's name was nowhere on the document. He'd never asked to be added. He'd just assumed that someday, when I was gone, it would all be his. He'd never bothered to check. "And," I said, pushing the ledger forward across the desk, "I want to file a lien against him for repayment of these personal loans, effective immediately, and I want to sell my house." John opened the ledger, his expression neutral as he read the first few entries. But as he turned the pages, as the amounts grew larger and the dates more recent, his face darkened. He didn't question a single entry. He knew me too well, knew I'd been keeping meticulous records since I was 18 years old. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and controlled anger. "Martha," he said quietly, this is financial abuse. You know that, don't you?" The words hit me like a physical blow. Financial abuse. I'd never thought of it that way, but hearing it spoken aloud, I realized it was exactly what it was. The constant demands for money, the guilt trips when I hesitated, the way they'd made me feel selfish for wanting to keep any of my own savings. The way they'd taken my generosity and turned it into an obligation. "I never wanted to think of it that way," I said quietly. "But yes, I suppose it is." John leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "The house will sell within a week in this market," he said. "Properties like yours, well-maintained, good neighborhood, no liens or complications, they're gold. I can list it privately with a trusted realtor, keep it quiet until it's done." He paused, looking at the ledger again. "The lien will be more complicated, but we can file it today. It will attach to any assets he has, including that truck you paid for, any bank accounts, any property he might own or acquire. He won't be able to sell anything, buy anything, or even get a loan without settling this debt first." He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Martha? This is final. There's no going back once we start this process." I thought about the hot water on my skin, the cruel words echoing in my kitchen, the years of being made to feel like a burden in my own home. I thought about the basement room, the constant walking on eggshells, the way they'd erased me from my own life piece by piece. "He told me to go die somewhere else, John," I said, my voice steady as a rock. I'm just taking his advice. I'm going to go live somewhere else instead. John nodded slowly, then reached for his phone. Let me make some calls, he said. We'll get this done right, and we'll get it done fast. You deserve better than this, Martha. Earl would be proud of you. Earl. I could almost hear his voice, could almost feel his hand on my shoulder. Stand up for yourself, Martha. He'd always said, don't let anyone make you feel small. I'd forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way, but I was remembering it now. It took 8 days. 8 days that felt like the longest and shortest of my life. 8 days for Mr. Plashcoffing's Abernathy to list the property privately with a trusted realtor named Rebecca Chen, a sharp, efficient woman in her 40s who took one look at the house and nodded approvingly. Beautiful bones, she said, walking through the rooms with a practiced eye. Excellent condition. The location is perfect, close to downtown but quiet. I have 3 clients who've been looking for exactly this type of property. She was right. The house sold for cash to a young doctor named James Murphy and his wife, Sarah, who were moving to town to work at the county hospital. They didn't want a showing, didn't want to negotiate. They just wanted a home with good bones, a home with history, a home where they could build their own family legacy. I spent those 8 days in a small, clean motel on the edge of town, the Bluegrass Inn, a modest place that had been there since I was a child. I paid in cash from the last of my emergency fund, the money I'd been saving for my own funeral, ironically enough. The room was simple but comfortable, with a small kitchenette and a view of the rolling hills beyond the town. I didn't leave my room much during those 8 days. I was waiting, holding my breath, wondering if I'd really have the courage to see this through. But every time I doubted myself, I remembered his words, "Go die somewhere else," and my resolve hardened like steel. My phone began ringing on the second day. First confusion, then annoyance, then pure, undiluted panic. I let every call go to voicemail, but I listened to each one, documenting this final chapter of our relationship just as carefully as I'd documented all the money I'd given him over the years. The first call was from David, his voice irritated but not yet worried. "Mom, where are you? Crystal made dinner and you weren't there. Call me back." The second call, later that evening, was more concerned. "Mom, it's David. Your car's not in the driveway, and Mrs. Henderson said she saw you getting on the bus this morning with a suitcase. What's going on? Call me." By the 4th day, the calls were coming from Crystal too, her voice shrill with barely contained anger. "Martha, whatever game you're playing, it's not funny. We have responsibilities, we have bills to pay, and we need you to come home right now." The calls kept coming, David's voice growing more frantic, Crystal's more demanding. Then other voices joined in, Crystal's mother, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. David's supervisor from work, apparently concerned about his distracted behavior. Even my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, wanting to know if I was all right. But I didn't answer. I was done being available for their convenience, done being their solution to every problem, done being the one who always gave in, always compromised, always sacrificed my own needs for theirs. On the 6th day, I heard desperation creeping into David's voice. "Mom, please. I don't know what I did wrong, but I'm sorry. Just come home. We can talk about whatever's bothering you." Too little, too late. 35 years too late. The certified letters arrived at the house on a Tuesday morning. I wasn't there to see them delivered, but I could imagine the scene. The mail carrier, probably someone I'd known for years, walking up the front path with the official-looking envelopes, the doorbell ringing. Crystal, answering in her silk robe, signing for the letters with her perfectly manicured nails. One letter was from Mr. Abernathy's office, written in formal legal language that left no room for misinterpretation. It detailed the sale of the property and gave them 30 days to vacate. It listed the closing date, the sale price, and the name of the new owners. It was businesslike, official, and utterly final. The other letter was from the county court, notifying David of a legal lien filed against him in the amount of $87,450, citing the documented loans detailed in my ledger. It explained that the lien would attach to any assets he currently owned or might acquire in the future, and that it would remain in effect until the debt was paid in full. That night, my phone rang constantly. I finally turned it off, but not before listening to one last voicemail from David. His voice was broken, desperate, unrecognizable from the angry man who'd thrown hot water at me just over a week ago. Mom, what the hell is this? What have you done? Some lawyer sent us letters saying you sold the house. Our house. You can't do that. This is insane. And this other thing, this lien? $87,000? What is this insanity? You are ruining our lives. Crystal is losing her mind. She's talking about leaving, about going back to her mother's. You call me back. You call me back right now. You have lost your damn mind, you old woman. This is elder abuse. This is. His voice broke then, and I heard something I hadn't heard in years, David crying. Not the manipulative tears of a man trying to get his way, but the raw, desperate sobs of someone whose world had just collapsed around him. I listened to the message once, my hand resting on the cool glass of the motel window, watching the lights of the town twinkle in the distance. Then I deleted it, just as I'd deleted all the others. I had not lost my mind. I had finally found it. The money from the sale felt like a weight in my hands, not of wealth, but of responsibility. The check was for more than I'd ever seen at one time. The housing market had been good to me, and the young doctor and his wife had paid asking price without negotiation. After paying off the small remaining balance on my credit cards and settling my account with Mr. Abernathy, I had enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I could have bought a small condo in one of those senior communities, lived out my days in quiet comfort, playing bridge and complaining about the weather. But that felt like an ending, and I was looking for a beginning. I thought about the other women I knew, the quiet widows in my church who'd been pushed aside by their own families. I thought about my friend Eleanor, whose children had put her in a sterile apartment complex and visited once a month if she was lucky. I thought about Mary, the retired schoolteacher who'd lost her pension to a scam and was now living on Social Security alone. I thought about the way we were spoken to at the doctor's office, at the bank, sometimes even by our own families, as if we were children or ghosts, or burdens to be managed rather than people with wisdom and experience and value. So I did something Earl would have called crazy, something that made me feel more alive than I'd felt in years. I bought the old Hatcher place, a dilapidated farmhouse on 20 acres of overgrown land that had been sitting empty for a decade. The paint was peeling, the porch was sagging, and the barn leaned like a tired old man. But the foundation was stone, solid as the day it was built, and the view of the rolling Kentucky hills was priceless. I didn't want another house. I wanted a sanctuary. I wanted to build something new from the ashes of what I'd lost. I hired a local crew, young men who needed the work, and I paid them well. We restored the house, not to its former glory, but to a new purpose. We put in 4 comfortable, private suites, each with its own bathroom and sitting area. We created a large communal kitchen with modern appliances and a dining room table big enough for 8. We built a wide, screened-in porch with rocking chairs and a view of the hills. We cleared the land and planted a huge garden, vegetables and herbs and flowers, everything we'd need to feed ourselves and our souls. We fixed the barn and turned it into a workshop and library, a place where we could pursue hobbies and interests that had been set aside for years. I called it the Hearthstone, not a shelter, not a home for the aged, not a place where people went to wait for death, a hearth. A place of warmth and center, a place where women like me could reclaim their lives and their dignity. My first resident was Eleanor, whose children had been so relieved to have someone else take responsibility for their mother that they'd actually thanked me. Eleanor moved in with 2 suitcases and a lifetime of stories, and within a week, she was helping me plan the garden layout. The second was Mary, the retired schoolteacher who'd lost her pension. She arrived with boxes of books and a determination to start the literacy program she'd always dreamed of. We converted part of the barn into a classroom, and within a month, she was teaching reading to adults who'd never had the chance to learn properly. The third was a woman named Rose, whose husband had died and left her with debts she couldn't pay. She'd been living in her car when a friend told her about the hearthstone. She moved into the third suite and took over the garden, turning it into something that would have made Earl proud. We didn't have rules at the hearthstone, only understandings. We shared the cooking, with each woman contributing her specialties and family recipes. We tended the garden together, worked in the barn together, sat on the porch in the evenings, and told the stories no one else had wanted to. It was a quiet afternoon in late spring, almost a year to the day since I had walked out of my old life. The air smelled of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. I was on the porch, showing Rose how to properly prune the tomato plants, when a dusty, beaten-down car I didn't recognize pulled into our long gravel driveway. It sputtered to a stop, and a man got out. It was David. He looked a decade older. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. His clothes were worn, and he had lost the arrogant posture he once carried like a shield. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at the house, at the thriving garden, at the women sitting peacefully on the porch. He looked like a ghost visiting a world he couldn't enter. He walked slowly towards me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Eleanor and Mary fell silent, watching. They knew this moment. They had lived their own versions of it. "Mom," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was the first time he'd called me that in what felt like a lifetime. I didn't answer. I just straightened up, wiping the dirt from my hands onto my apron. "Crystal left me," he said, his eyes fixed on the ground. "She took the kids and went back to her mother's 6 months ago, said I was a failure. I lost the truck. The lien. I couldn't get another loan. I've been sleeping on a friend's couch." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading shame. "I see what you've built here," he said, gesturing vaguely at the house, the barn, the life humming around us. You did all this." "Yes," I said, my voice calm and even. "I did." "I'm sorry," he whispered, and this time the words didn't sound like a manipulation. They sounded like the last coins in a beggar's pocket. "For everything. The water, what I said. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Is there any way I can fix this? Can I help? Can I come home?" Come home. The words hung in the warm air. I thought of the $87,000. I thought of the words, "Go die somewhere else." I looked at his face, the face I had once loved more than my own life, and I felt not anger, but a profound and final clarity. "This is not your home, David," I said softly, but with the unshakable firmness of a gravestone. "You had a home, you had a mother, you had a legacy. You and your wife burned it all down for convenience." I took a step closer. "I didn't build this place out of revenge. I built it on the ashes of the life you destroyed. The women here," I said, gesturing to Eleanor and Rose, who were watching with quiet dignity, "they are my family now. We don't measure worth here by what you can provide, but by the respect you can show." A lesson you never learned. He flinched, but he didn't argue. "I have nothing for you," I continued. "No money, no second chances, and no room at the hearthstone. My ledger with you is closed. But I will give you the same thing I gave myself, a chance to build something from nothing." I pointed towards the rolling hills, towards the long road that led away from us. "Go, be a better man than the one who stood in my kitchen that day. That is the only apology I will ever accept." He stood there for another moment, the hope draining from his face, replaced by a slow, dawning understanding. He nodded once, a small, defeated gesture, then turned and walked back to his broken-down car without another word. As he drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust, Eleanor came and stood beside me, placing a warm, wrinkled hand on my arm. "That was the hardest thing a mother can do," she said softly. "No," I replied, watching the dust settle. "The hardest thing was staying silent for all those years. This was just business."